It was a chilly, gray evening in the heart of the city, with the streets buzzed with a strange mix of life and loneliness. The kind of night where the wind nipped at your face and made you pull your coat tighter, even if it wasn't enough to keep the cold out. Beneath the faint glow of a flickering street lamp, a homeless man sat cross-legged on the cracked pavement, his few belongings tucked into a tattered backpack. His companion, a scruffy dog with a patchy coat and soulful eyes, sat loyally by his side, its tail wagging weakly every time its owner spoke. Together, they painted a picture of quiet resilience, a bond unbroken despite the harshness of the world around them. The man's name was Charlie. For years, he had been a familiar face to anyone who frequented the neighborhood. He wasn't the kind of beggar who harassed passersby or muttered angrily under his breath. Charlie had a way about him, gentle, almost dignified, that made people stop and drop a coin or two into his tin cup. It wasn't much, but it kept him and his dog, Buddy, going. On most days, Charlie would hum a soft tune while Buddy rested his head on his lap, as if they both understood that life, no matter how hard, still had its small moments of peace. But not everyone who walked by saw Charlie and Buddy with kindness. That night, three figures loomed in the distance, their shadows stretching long and ominous against the dimly lit sidewalk. They were young, loud, and brimming with the kind of arrogance that comes from thinking the world owes you something. They laughed and shoved each other, their voices echoing down the empty street. Anyone who heard them would have known to steer clear. Charlie didn't notice them at first. He was busy talking to Buddy, his voice low and soothing, as if the dog could truly understand every word. "Tomorrow'll be better," Charlie said, scratching behind Buddy's ears. "You'll see. Maybe we'll get lucky and find a warm spot to sleep." The trio's laughter grew louder as they approached, their footsteps quickening with purpose. Buddy's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Charlie looked up, his expression wary but calm. He'd dealt with trouble before. On the streets, trouble was as common as the cold. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, his tone mocking. He was tall, with a wiry build and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. The other two flanked him like hyenas circling prey, their movements jittery and full of misplaced bravado. Charlie straightened his back, but didn't say anything. He'd learned that silence was often the best defense. Buddy, however, wasn't as restrained. The dog bared its teeth, a fierce snarl escaping its mouth. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make the shortest of the three take a step back. "What's this?" The tall one sneered, pointing at Buddy. "You got yourself a guard dog. Looks more like a stray to me." The others laughed, egging him on. One of them kicked over Charlie's tin cup, sending a few scattered coins clanking onto the sidewalk. Charlie winced but said nothing. He reached out to steady Buddy, his hand trembling slightly. "Relax, old man," the tall one said, crouching down so he was eye level with Charlie. "We just want to talk. You've been out here a while, haven't you? Must have seen a lot. Heard a lot. Bet you've even got some secrets." He leaned closer, his grin turning sinister. "What do you say you share some of that? Or maybe we take it." The tension hung thick in the air. Buddy barked, the sound sharp and full of warning. One of the boys flinched, but the tall one held his ground, his smirk unwavering. He reached out a hand toward Buddy, as if daring the dog to bite him. "You think this mutt's gonna save you?" He taunted. "Please, it's just a dumb dog." Before Charlie could respond, the situation took an unexpected turn. From the shadows, a voice rang out, calm, steady, and laced with authority. "That's enough." The trio froze, their heads snapping toward the source of the voice. A figure emerged from the darkness, his stride purposeful and unhurried. He wore a simple leather jacket and jeans. his hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been walking for hours. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped the boys in their tracks. It was his presence, an air of quiet confidence that demanded attention without needing to raise his voice. The tall one stood up, his bravado faltering for the first time. "Who the hell are you?" The man stepped into the light, revealing a face that was instantly recognizable. Charlie's eyes widened in disbelief, and even Buddy seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening. The stranger tilted his head slightly, a small, almost amused smile playing on his lips. "You might want to rethink what you're doing," he said, his tone mild but firm. "Because that dumb dog you're mocking, he's a lot smarter than you think. And the man you're messing with, well, let's just say you're about to have a very bad night." The silence that followed was deafening. The trio exchanged nervous glances, the weight of the moment sinking in. They had no idea who they were dealing with, or just how much trouble they were in. But Charlie and Buddy knew. And as the stranger took another step forward, his calm demeanor never wavering, it was clear that things were about to take a dramatic turn. The question hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted? The tall boy's smirk faded entirely as the stranger stepped closer. His companions shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado melting under the man's steady gaze. There was something unsettling about him, something calm yet unshakably commanding. He didn't look angry. He didn't look scared either. He just stood there, his presence enough to make them hesitate. "Hey man, we were just joking around," the tall one said, trying to laugh it off. The sound was hollow, his earlier confidence nowhere to be found. "No harm done, right?" The stranger didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked down at Charlie, who was still sitting on the cold pavement with Buddy, protectively pressed against his side. The man's eyes softened for a moment as he took in the scene. The spilt coins, the tattered backpack, the loyal dog baring its teeth at the boys. "You okay?" the man asked Charlie, his voice quieter now, but still carrying an edge of concern. Charlie nodded slowly, his lips parting as if to say something, but no words came out. He seemed almost as stunned as the boys. Maybe it was because someone had finally stepped in to help, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that he recognized the man but couldn't quite place him. Buddy, however, seemed to know exactly who the stranger was. The dog's growl softened, his ears perking up as his tail gave a cautious wag. He nudged Charlie's hand with his nose, as if to say, "It's okay. This one's different." The stranger straightened up, his attention shifting back to the trio. "You think it's funny to push people around?" he asked, his tone even but cutting. "You think that makes you strong?" The tallest boy opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The other two took a step back, clearly uneasy. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who seemed so utterly unafraid of them. "Look, we didn't mean anything by it," one of the smaller boys muttered, his voice barely audible. "We were just messing around." "Messing around," the stranger repeated, as if testing the words. He took another step closer, and the boys instinctively backed away. You see a man trying to get by with his dog, and you think it's your job to make his life harder. That's your idea of fun. "It's not like that," the tall one blurted out, his voice cracking slightly. "We didn't know." "Didn't know what?" The man interrupted, his gaze narrowing. "That he's a person. That he's got a story, just like you. Or did you not care enough to think about it?" The boys were silent now, shifting awkwardly on their feet. For the first time, they looked less like predators and more like the kids they were, confused, nervous, and way out of their depth. The stranger let the silence hang for a moment before taking a deep breath and stepping back. Leave, he said simply, the word carrying a weight that made it clear he wasn't asking. They didn't need to be told twice. The tall one mumbled something that might have been an apology, but it was too rushed and garbled to be clear. The three of them turned and hurried off, their footsteps echoing down the empty street until they disappeared into the night. Charlie let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Buddy relaxed too, his tail wagging more freely now as he looked up at the stranger with something that could only be described as gratitude. "Thank you," Charlie said finally, his voice hoarse but sincere. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." The stranger waved it off, crouching down so he was at eye level with Buddy. He held out a hand, letting the dog sniff him before giving him a gentle pat on the head. "You've got a good friend here," he said, glancing up at Charlie. "He would have done his best to protect you." Charlie smiled faintly, his hand resting on Buddy's back. "He's all I've got." The stranger looked at him for a moment, as if weighing his next words carefully. "What's your name?" he asked. "Charlie," the man replied. "And this here's Buddy." "Charlie and Buddy," the stranger said, nodding. "I'm Keanu." Charlie's brow furrowed slightly, and his eyes narrowed as he studied the man's face. There was a flicker of recognition, like a puzzle piece clicking into place. "Wait," he said slowly. "Keanu, as in Keanu Reeves." Keanu smiled, a small, almost self-conscious grin. "That's me." Charlie stared at him, dumbfounded. For a moment, the street lamp, and the events of the night seemed to fade away, leaving only the surreal realization of who was standing in front of him. You're the guy from the movies," Charlie stammered, his voice tinged with disbelief. "John Wick, The Matrix. You're that guy." Keanu chuckled softly. "Yeah, I'm that guy." "But what are you doing here?" Charlie asked, still struggling to wrap his head around it. "Why would someone like you be walking around these streets, in the middle of the night?" Keanu's smile faded slightly, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Sometimes I just need to get away," he said. "Clear my head, you know. The city's different at night. It feels real, honest." Charlie nodded slowly, though he couldn't quite relate. For him, the city at night was less about honesty and more about survival. Still, there was something in Keanu's voice that made him believe it. Keanu glanced down at the scattered coins on the ground, then back at Charlie. "You've had a rough time, haven't you?" he asked gently. Charlie hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I manage. Me and Buddy, we manage." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a neatly folded bill. He crouched down and placed it carefully into Charlie's tin cup, alongside the few remaining coins. Charlie's eyes widened when he saw the denomination, $100 bill. "I can't take that," Charlie said, shaking his head. "Sure you can," Keanu replied with a warm smile. "Think of it as a thank you. You've probably been through more than most people could handle, and you're still here. That deserves something." Charlie's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Finally, he managed to say, "Thank you." Keanu nodded, then stood up, his gaze drifting toward the street where the boys had disappeared. "You'll be okay tonight?" he asked. Charlie looked down at Buddy, who was now leaning against him, his tail thumping softly against the ground. "Yeah," he said, "we'll be okay." Keanu lingered for a moment, as if he wanted to say more, but then he simply smiled again and gave a small wave. "Take care, Charlie. And you too, Buddy." With that, he turned and walked away, his figure blending into the shadows as easily as he had appeared. Charlie watched him go, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. It wasn't every day that someone stepped in to help him, let alone a movie star. Buddy nuzzled his hand, bringing him back to the present. Charlie smiled and scratched the dog behind the ears. "Well, buddy," he said softly, "I guess tonight wasn't so bad after all." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. Something about the way Keanu had appeared, and the way he'd left, made Charlie wonder if their paths would cross again. The days that followed felt different to Charlie. It wasn't just the $100 bill, though that was certainly a blessing. It was the strange encounter with Keanu, the lingering presence of the man who had stepped in to stop the trouble without a second thought. Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to that night, something that tied Keanu's unexpected appearance to his own life in a way he couldn't yet understand. Buddy, as always, was his anchor. The dog's soft eyes seemed to understand the confusion Charlie was feeling, offering the kind of loyalty that only an animal who had shared in the struggle could give. Together, they kept to their usual routine. They wandered through the city, finding corners to rest in, and the occasional friendly face who would offer a spare coin or two. The cold nights seemed harsher now, the city's indifferent hum louder and more unwelcoming. Still, Charlie found solace in Buddy's company. But in the back of his mind, there was a constant question. Why had Keanu helped him? And why did it feel like their paths weren't done crossing? A week later, Charlie sat in his usual spot, tucked into a small alcove beneath the shelter of an old, abandoned building. He leaned against the wall, his legs pulled close to his chest for warmth, and Buddy sat dutifully by his side. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the city was wrapped in the heavy blanket of night. The streets were quieter now, the rush of daily life replaced by a sense of stillness that felt almost too thick to breathe through. Charlie reached into his pocket and pulled out the crisp $100 bill Keanu had given him. He had been careful with it, trying not to spend it all at once. It was a rare kind of gift, and Charlie knew better than to waste something so valuable. His fingers lingered on the edges of the bill, turning it over in his hands. What was Keanu really trying to do? Was it just charity, or had it been something more? His thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see a man walking down the street, his gait purposeful but unhurried. The man's face was hidden in shadow, but there was something about the way he moved that made Charlie sit up straighter. He'd seen him before. He couldn't quite place it, but something in his gut told him this wasn't just any passerby. The man stopped in front of Charlie, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. "Hey, old man," the man said, his voice gruff and dismissive. "You still around here, begging for scraps?" Charlie didn't answer immediately. He knew the type, people who like to make others feel small. But there was something about this man that felt different. He studied him closely, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of familiarity. The man smirked, noticing Charlie's wariness. "Not talkative tonight, huh? Don't blame you. It's tough out here for people like you." Charlie's heart skipped a beat. The man wasn't just any passerby. This was one of the trio from the night Keanu had intervened. The tall one, the one who had mocked Buddy, the one who had kicked over his tin cup. For a brief moment, the old instinctual fear rose in Charlie's chest. He knew that face, and he knew exactly what this man was capable of. But instead of backing down, Charlie leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with the man. He wasn't going to show fear, not again. Not after everything. "I'm just here minding my own business. You're the one who seems to have a problem with it." The man's smile twisted into something darker, and Charlie could see the flash of anger in his eyes. "You think you're better than us now, huh? Just 'cause some rich guy decided to play hero. Don't fool yourself. Nothing's changed." Charlie felt a chill crawl up his spine. The mention of Keanu sent an uncomfortable ripple through his thoughts. Was this man really that bitter? Did he think that because someone had stood up for him, it made Charlie worth something more? Or was it something else entirely? "You don't know anything about me," Charlie said, his voice low but steady. "Oh, I know enough," the man shot back. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "And I know that you don't belong here. You and your dog don't belong in this neighborhood, asking for handouts. People like you are just a stain on the city, and I'm gonna make sure you remember that." Charlie's heart raced. The tension in the air thickened, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Buddy, sensing the danger, growled low in his throat, ready to defend. But before Charlie could respond, the man took a step back, his hands rising in mock surrender. "You know what?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Maybe I'll let you have your little space for now. But don't forget, this place isn't your home. You're just passing through. And when the time comes, you'll remember who owns these streets." With that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as suddenly as he had arrived. Charlie stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. What did the man mean by that? What was he really threatening? The words echoed in his head, bouncing off the walls of his thoughts. Buddy nudged Charlie's hand, as if urging him to shake off the unease. But it wasn't that simple. Charlie had seen enough to know that threats like that weren't empty. The street had a way of making people pay for what they did, and sometimes the price wasn't just measured in money. As Charlie tried to calm his racing thoughts, he couldn't help but feel like the dark clouds that had gathered that night were only the beginning. What if Keanu's presence hadn't been a coincidence after all? What if this was more than just a one-time act of kindness? Was he connected to the danger that now loomed over Charlie and Buddy? For the first time in a long while, Charlie felt the weight of something bigger than just surviving. There was a war brewing in the shadows, a conflict that reached far beyond the broken streets he called home. And whether he liked it or not, Charlie had been drawn into the middle of it. With Buddy at his side, Charlie took a deep breath, looking out at the empty street. This wasn't just about the next meal or the next corner to sleep on. Something had shifted, something darker, and it was coming for them all. Charlie couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in his bones. The man's words kept echoing in his mind, each repetition only adding weight to the suspicion that was growing heavier by the day. This place isn't your home. You're just passing through. The threat hung over him like a storm cloud, and Charlie could feel it closing in, inch by inch. For the first time in a long while, he found it hard to breathe in the familiar streets. What had once felt like a world he could navigate with his eyes closed now seemed dangerous and unpredictable. It wasn't just the looming presence of the tall man who had threatened him, but the growing realization that whatever had happened that night with Keanu wasn't just a random act of kindness. Keanu's intervention, his sudden appearance, the ease with which he had handled the situation, it all felt deliberate. And Charlie couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story than he had been told. Buddy, sensing Charlie's discomfort, stayed close to his side as they moved through the city. The dog had always been his anchor, the one constant in a world that never stopped shifting. But even Buddy seemed uneasy now, his ears pricked, his eyes darting around as if waiting for something to happen. Charlie couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It wasn't just the people passing by or the occasional curious glance. It was something deeper, something more persistent. Every corner he turned, every alley he passed, it felt like someone was right behind him. He tried to shake off the thought, convincing himself it was just paranoia. After all, the streets could make anyone feel like they were being hunted. But the feeling wouldn't go away. The next night, as the shadows grew long and the city descended into its usual lull, Charlie and Buddy found themselves near the same old abandoned building. The spot had become their makeshift home, safe, familiar, and always quiet, at least until recently. Tonight, though, there was a tension in the air that Charlie couldn't quite place. He glanced around, his instincts alert, his heart beating faster with every passing moment. Buddy growled softly, his body stiffening beside him. The dog's alertness didn't help the knot that had formed in Charlie's stomach. He knew something was wrong. He just couldn't put his finger on it. Suddenly, the quiet of the night was broken by the sound of footsteps, sharp and deliberate, coming from the direction of the alley. Charlie's pulse quickened. It wasn't a casual passerby this time. The footsteps were too measured, too intentional. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the street. And there, standing under the dim glow of the streetlight, was the man, the one who had threatened him. The tall one. The one who had mocked Buddy and seemed to hold some strange grudge against Charlie. But this time, the man wasn't alone. There were two others with him, figures cloaked in shadow, their faces hidden beneath hoods. They moved in sync, like they were part of something bigger, something coordinated. Charlie's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. This felt like a setup. The tall man looked directly at Charlie, his expression cold and calculating. "You're not getting away this time," he said, his voice low, menacing. "You and your dog. You're just a nuisance. And we don't like nuisances." Charlie's heart pounded in his chest. He tried to steady his breathing, to think of a way out, but his mind raced too quickly. There was nowhere to run. The alley was blocked off behind him, and the three of them were closing in, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators closing in on their prey. Buddy, sensing the danger, began to growl more loudly, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. But the dog was small, and Charlie knew that a fight with three men wouldn't end well for either of them. He had to think fast, had to find a way to survive. "Listen," Charlie said, his voice shaking but firm. "I don't want any trouble. You've made your point. Just let us go. You've got nothing to gain by doing this." The tall man laughed, a hollow sound that echoed down the alley. "You still don't get it, do you? It's not about gaining anything. It's about making sure you understand your place. You're nothing, just a rat in the gutter." Charlie's stomach churned at the words, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to beg. Not again. Not for these people. Not after everything he had survived. "I'm not your target. If you've got a problem with me, fine, but leave Buddy out of this." Buddy let out a low, guttural growl, a warning that sent a chill down Charlie's spine. The dog was ready to protect him, no matter the cost. But Charlie couldn't let that happen. He wouldn't let Buddy get hurt because of him. He glanced around frantically, looking for something, anything, that could help them escape. His eyes landed on a rusty metal pole lying in the dirt beside an old dumpster. Without thinking, he reached for it, gripping it tightly in his hand. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You really think you can fight us off with that?" The tall man sneered, clearly amused by Charlie's attempt at self-defense. "You're pathetic." The two hooded figures moved in closer, their steps slow, as if savoring the moment. Charlie's pulse raced, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the crushing weight of fear. But then something shifted, something he couldn't explain. It was the sound of a voice, familiar, steady, and undeniably certain. "Hey," the voice cut through the tension like a knife. The three men turned sharply, their faces twisting with surprise and confusion. But Charlie's heart leaped into his throat, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he might be imagining things. There, standing at the edge of the alley, was Keanu. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused. He was alone this time, but there was something different about him, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. He stood tall, as if he knew exactly what was coming, and he wasn't afraid. "You've made your point," Keanu said, his voice low but commanding. "Now it's time to leave. Walk away, and we won't have any more problems." The three men hesitated, their eyes flicking between Keanu and each other, uncertainty creeping in. For a moment, the alley was eerily quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the tall man took a step forward, his posture brimming with hostility. "Who the hell are you to tell us what to do?" he sneered. Keanu didn't flinch. "I'm the one who's going to make sure you don't do any more harm tonight." The words hung in the air, and the tension was so palpable that Charlie could almost hear his own heart thudding in his chest. What would happen next? Would Keanu really step in to protect them again? Or was this the moment the darkness in the alley finally swallowed them whole? The three men were still, waiting, sizing up the stranger. Charlie could feel the weight of the moment shifting, the air crackling with anticipation, but everything seemed to hang on the edge of a razor blade. And for the first time, he wasn't sure what would happen next. The silence in the alley stretched out for what felt like hours. The three men stood motionless, sizing up Keanu, and Charlie could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what to expect, but he hoped, prayed even, that Keanu was really the man he seemed to be, someone who could end this nightmare once and for all. But then, as if everything had shifted in a split second, the tall man let out a low, mocking chuckle, breaking the heavy silence. "You think you're some kind of hero." His voice was dripping with disdain. "You've got no idea what you're dealing with." Keanu didn't respond. He stood firm, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never wavered. He was calm, too calm, and something about it sent a chill down Charlie's spine. He could tell that Keanu wasn't afraid, but what if that was because he knew something the rest of them didn't? The tall man raised his hand, signaling to the two others, and in that instant, they moved with unnatural speed, flanking Keanu on both sides. Charlie's breath caught in his throat. He had been hoping that Keanu was here to stop this, but now it looked like they were preparing for a fight, one that Charlie didn't think any of them could win. "Get out of the way, old man," the tall one spat. "We've got business to finish, and it doesn't involve you." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he didn't budge. Instead, he reached into his coat, and for a moment, Charlie thought he might pull out a weapon, something to even the odds. But what Keanu revealed was far more unexpected. From under his coat, Keanu pulled out a small black notebook. He flipped it open, his fingers moving quickly over the pages as if searching for something. Charlie blinked, confused. What was this? Some kind of personal journal? Was this the big move that would save them? The tall man sneered, clearly unimpressed. "You brought a notebook to a fight? Are you trying to write us to death?" But Keanu didn't answer. Instead, his finger landed on a specific page, and then he looked up, meeting the eyes of each man in turn. "You've made a mistake," Keanu said, his voice steady, but with an edge that sent a shock through Charlie. "You don't know who I am, do you?" The tall man paused, his expression flickering with doubt. The two other figures beside him looked uneasy now, exchanging glances. But before they could respond, Keanu spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "The person you've been hunting isn't who you think he is." The tension in the alley thickened. Charlie's head spun, and his gut twisted as Keanu's words sank in. What did he mean? Who was he talking about? Was it him? Was Charlie the target? Or was it something even more sinister? Before anyone could react, Keanu snapped the notebook shut, his eyes narrowing. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about justice. Suddenly, Charlie felt a shift in the air, a subtle change that was almost imperceptible, but it was there, unmistakable. His thoughts raced, but it was as though everything around him slowed, as if the truth was hanging just out of reach. The tall man, now visibly agitated, turned to his companions, whispering urgently, though Charlie could barely hear them over the rush of blood in his ears. The two hooded figures seemed to hesitate, glancing back and forth between Keanu and each other, their uncertainty growing. For a moment, Charlie wondered if they were considering backing down. Then something unexpected happened. One of the hooded figures stepped forward, his hands raised in what seemed to be an attempt at peace. "Wait," he said, his voice softer than Charlie had expected. This isn't what we thought. But the tall man cut him off sharply. "Enough talking. We're done here." He swung his fist toward Keanu, his movement fast, brutal. But Keanu didn't flinch. In one fluid motion, he stepped aside, effortlessly dodging the punch, and with a swift movement, he grabbed the man's arm, twisting it behind his back. The force of the maneuver made the tall man grunt in pain as Keanu held him there, completely under control. The other two men froze, their eyes wide with shock. This wasn't what they had expected, and for a brief moment, they seemed unsure of what to do next. But before anyone could react, the tall man let out a guttural laugh, his voice strained with a mix of pain and disbelief. "You really think you've won? You don't even know what you're messing with, do you? We're not just some street thugs. This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us." Keanu's grip tightened, and Charlie saw the hard glint in his eyes. "I know exactly what you're involved in," Keanu said quietly. "And I know exactly how to take you down." For a moment, there was a strange silence, like the calm before a storm. The air was charged, and Charlie could feel the tension in every muscle of his body. What was Keanu talking about? What was this bigger thing the men were involved in? And how was he connected to it? The tall man looked over his shoulder, his eyes wild, as if searching for an escape. His companions were still frozen, unsure of how to proceed. They had underestimated Keanu, and now they were trapped. But just as Charlie thought the situation might resolve, a voice rang out from the shadows behind him, a voice that sent a cold shiver down his spine. "You should have stayed out of this, Keanu." Charlie whipped around, his eyes wide in shock. Standing at the far end of the alley, his features hidden beneath a dark hood, was a figure Charlie recognized instantly. It was the third man, the one who had been lurking in the background the whole time. He hadn't seen him before, but he knew this face. The one that haunted his dreams. The figure stepped forward, revealing a sinister grin as he lowered his hood, and Charlie's blood ran cold. "You thought you could save the day, didn't you?" The man sneered. "You're just another pawn in this game, and you'll learn that the hard way." Keanu's expression didn't falter. "You're too late." But as Charlie watched, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about a few petty street thugs anymore. This was something far darker, something that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. And now it was about to explode. The stakes had just been raised, and Charlie was about to find out just how deep the rabbit hole went. The figure stepped further into the dim light, his presence casting a chilling shadow over the alley. Charlie's heart pounded as recognition dawned. This wasn't just another thug or random stranger. This was the man who had been pulling the strings all along, the one behind everything that had been happening. The one who had orchestrated the series of events leading up to this moment. The stranger's smile widened as he saw the shock in Charlie's eyes. "Did you really think it was all just a coincidence?" He sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Keanu's little show, your so-called rescue, none of it was by accident." Keanu, who had been holding the tall man in a tight grip, stiffened at the mention of the man's name. His eyes flicked to the newcomer, a mixture of recognition and contempt flashing across his face. "I should have known you'd be involved in this, Elias," he said, his tone ice cold. "It's always you." Elias' grin grew wider, and Charlie could feel the atmosphere in the alley change once again, thick with danger and uncertainty. The tall man squirmed in Keanu's grip, his eyes darting between the two men, but there was something almost frantic about his movements now. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and it was clear he was no longer in control. "You think you've won, Keanu?" Elias mocked. "You're just as much of a pawn as the rest of us. Always have been. Always will be." Keanu's expression hardened, his grip tightening around the tall man's arm. "I'm no one's pawn," he said with quiet menace, his eyes never leaving Elias. "And you'll never control me again." Charlie, standing in the middle of it all, was dizzy with confusion. What was Keanu talking about? Who was this Elias, and why was he so important? The answers seemed to slip through his fingers the more he tried to understand. But what he did know was that this confrontation had just escalated to something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. Elias's smile faded slightly, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes, something more dangerous. "You think you're the hero, don't you?" He spat. "But you're no different than the rest of us. We're all just trying to survive. Just trying to get by in a world that's gone to hell. And you, Keanu, you're just another part of the system." Keanu didn't flinch. "I've been fighting the system for longer than you can imagine," he said, his voice firm. "And I'll keep fighting it until I break it." Elias's eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting toward Charlie. A new intensity filled the air as the two men locked eyes. "And you," Elias said, his voice suddenly cold, "you're not just some beggar. You're far more dangerous than you think." Charlie's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elias' grin returned, but it was darker, more knowing. "You've been playing your part too well, Charlie. Too well. You think you're just a victim here, but you've been part of the game all along." Charlie's mind reeled. What game? How was he involved in all of this? He had been just trying to survive, just trying to make it through each day. But now it seemed like everything he had known was a lie. "You're not who you think you are," Elias continued, his words heavy with meaning. "You've been chosen, just like Keanu, just like me." Keanu's expression tightened, and the tall man, still trapped in Keanu's hold, stiffened at the mention of Charlie's name. There was a growing tension in the air, and Charlie felt as though the world was closing in on him. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Elias stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's time for you to realize the truth, Charlie. You're not just some homeless beggar. You're a player in a much larger game than you could ever understand." Charlie's mind raced, the weight of Elias's words settling heavily on his chest. He felt dizzy, as if the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. But before he could process any more, Keanu moved. With a sudden fluid motion, he released the tall man and turned toward Elias. His eyes locked onto him with cold fury. "You're right about one thing," Keanu said, his voice like steel. "This is bigger than us. But it's not something I'm going to let you win." In an instant, Keanu lunged at Elias, his movements precise and swift. Elias barely had time to react before Keanu tackled him to the ground, his fists moving with purpose. The two men struggled, rolling across the pavement, their movements a blur of violent energy. Charlie stood frozen, unable to look away as the two men fought with everything they had. It was like watching a storm unfold right before his eyes, each blow landing with the force of a thunderclap. The sound of fists against flesh filled the alley, echoing off the walls, but it was clear that neither man was willing to back down. Then, just as Charlie thought the fight might reach its peak, something unexpected happened. The tall man, the one who had been held captive by Keanu moments earlier, suddenly broke free, staggering to his feet. But instead of helping Elias, he turned and fled down the alley, disappearing into the night without a second glance. Charlie's heart raced. What was happening? What had just changed? Keanu and Elias continued to struggle, but it was clear now that Keanu had the upper hand. With one final, powerful shove, Keanu knocked Elias to the ground, his chest heaving as he stood over him, victorious. But before Charlie could process what had just happened, something strange occurred. Elias, lying on the ground, looked up at Keanu with a mixture of disbelief and something darker, something far more dangerous. "You think this is over?" Elias sneered, his eyes burning with malice. "This is only the beginning, Keanu. You can't stop what's already in motion." Keanu's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked toward Charlie, his eyes softening slightly as he reached out a hand. Charlie, still in shock, took it without hesitation. The weight of everything that had just unfolded began to sink in. He had learned too much too quickly, things that didn't make sense. The mystery of Keanu, the strange men who had been following him, and now the revelation that he was somehow involved in something much bigger. His mind reeled. "Come on," Keanu said quietly, his voice steady. "We're getting out of here. It's not over yet, but we'll figure it out." Charlie nodded, but as they turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was one last twist waiting to unfold, one that would shatter everything he thought he knew. Just as they reached the end of the alley, Charlie heard a sound behind them, footsteps, slow and deliberate. He turned, his breath catching in his throat, and there, standing in the shadows, was the last person he ever expected to see. The tall man had returned, but now there was something different in his eyes. Charlie's blood ran cold. "I told you," the man whispered, his voice low and dangerous. "This is just the beginning." And with that, everything exploded into chaos. Charlie's heart hammered in his chest as he turned to face the tall man, who had reappeared out of nowhere, his figure shrouded in shadows. The alley, once filled with the tension of a battle, was now eerily quiet, and the only sound that could be heard was the rhythmic echo of Charlie's own breath. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. His feet felt like they were cemented to the ground as the tall man stepped closer. Keanu, however, was already in motion. His hand gripped Charlie's arm gently but firmly, pulling him back. "We're not running," Keanu said, his voice steady, even as the tall man's footsteps grew louder, closer. "We'll finish this. Together." Charlie didn't understand how Keanu could stay so calm. After everything, after the confrontation, the truth about Elias, the revelations, it seemed like the world had just flipped on its head. Everything was connected, and nothing made sense. But somehow, in that moment, he trusted Keanu. He had to. "You think you can stop me?" The tall man spat, his eyes burning with anger. "You're just a man pretending to be something more. You don't even know who you're dealing with." Charlie's stomach twisted at the coldness in the man's voice. But Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the man's with unwavering determination. "No one is going to control me anymore," Keanu said, his voice quiet but full of authority. "Not you, not Elias, no one." The tall man grinned, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "You don't understand, do you? There's a bigger game at play here. You can't stop it." Charlie glanced from Keanu to the tall man, trying to make sense of the situation. The feeling of being a pawn, a mere player in a game far larger than anything he could comprehend, pressed heavily on his chest. For the first time, he realized just how little he knew about the world around him, how little he knew about the forces pulling the strings behind the scenes. Keanu, sensing his confusion, turned to Charlie and spoke in a low voice. "You were never just some beggar. You were part of this from the beginning." Charlie's mind reeled. What do you mean? I was just trying to survive. Trying to stay alive. I didn't ask for any of this. Keanu's gaze softened. None of us did. But sometimes survival means fighting back. And you've already been fighting, even if you didn't realize it. The tall man scoffed, rolling his eyes. This is pointless. You don't know what's coming. You can't stop what's already in motion. Charlie turned to Keanu, searching his eyes for answers. Keanu's gaze was steady, but there was a flicker of something deeper, something darker, that Charlie hadn't noticed before. It was like Keanu had been carrying this burden for far longer than he had let on. "Who are you, Keanu?" Charlie asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What is all of this? What's the truth?" Keanu looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "The truth is that the world isn't what it seems. We're all part of something bigger, something dangerous, and the only way to survive is to break the system that keeps us all trapped." Charlie didn't know what to make of it. But before he could process any more, the tall man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. Everything happened so fast that Charlie barely had time to react. In a blur, Keanu moved, intercepting the man's attack with a swift, fluid motion. The tall man staggered backward, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Keanu didn't waste any time. He grabbed the tall man by the throat, pinning him against the wall of the alley. "You've had your chance," Keanu growled. "Now it's over." But the tall man just smiled, his breath coming in quick, labored gasps. "You think this is over," he sneered. "You have no idea what you've just set in motion, what you've unleashed. It's bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Keanu's grip tightened, and for a moment, Charlie thought the man might choke right there. But then, in an instant, Keanu released him, stepping back and allowing the man to crumple to the ground. "I don't need to know what's coming next," Keanu said, his voice cold and resolute. "I'm going to make sure it ends here. Now." The tall man, gasping for breath, slowly lifted his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You really don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "You can't escape your past, and you can't stop what's been set in motion." Keanu's face remained unreadable, his eyes hard. "I don't need to escape my past. I'm ready to face it. And whatever's coming next, I'll deal with it." With that, Keanu turned to Charlie, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's over now. For both of us." Charlie stood there, trying to process everything. The truth about Keanu, the mystery surrounding Elias, the strange connection between all of them, it was a lot to take in. But as he looked at Keanu, at the calm certainty in his eyes, he realized that no matter how overwhelming the situation had been, they had made it through. They had faced the darkness together, and somehow they had won. The tall man groaned from the ground, his hands clutching his throat as he struggled to get up. But Keanu didn't even look back. Instead, he walked away, Charlie following close behind, their steps echoing in the empty alley. As they reached the end of the alley and emerged into the quiet streets, Charlie couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. The battle was over, but the war, it seemed, was far from finished. The world around him was still full of secrets, secrets that he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover.